In today's episode, a bunch of new records from Felix Zemdeg's, giveaway of the book Cracking the Cube by Ian Sheffler, and an interview with the author Ian Sheffler. Hey, Shiny from SpeedCubeReview.com with the SpeedCube Review podcast. This is episode 8. Now, I'm not going to talk too long because the interview with Ian Sheffler went for quite a long time, and that way we can get right to that. I'm not going to talk too much about the competition that I did about a week and a half ago because I already did a video going over some of those solves. It was MCC Gamma 2017. It went well. Nothing crazy happened. I think all of my solves were kind of average. I didn't do anything exceptional, but I didn't do anything ridiculous either. As far as new puzzles for this week, there's not actually that many that seem to have been advertised or coming out. There's a Chi-Yi that's the, I think, 2x2x3, which should be coming out really soon. I actually think I might be getting it before the end of the week, so look out for that. A big one that got advertised that some people might have heard about, but everyone kind of heard about now is the GAN Air SM. That is the cube that Felix used to set the world record. The big thing is, no one seems to really know exactly what it is. Some people think it's a softer magnetic, some people think stronger magnetic, some people think it's the standard magnetic. No one really knows. There's a kind of a rumor that it might be brought out during Nationals or at least Worlds. We'll see what happens with that. As far as world records, there was a ton. Now, before I go further with any new ones, there was one that I forgot to say last week from Benjamin Kyle, set the new Pyramid single world record of 1.28 seconds. The big ones that happened, though, this week, a ton from Felix Zemdeg's. He set the Rubik's Cube average of 5.97 seconds, which is the first one under 6 seconds. He also did another average that was under the former world record, so if he didn't get it with that one, he would have had it anyways. There's also the 4x4 single world record of 19.36 from Felix, the 5x5 single world record of 41.24, the 5x5 average world record of 47.88. He also set some other ones like the 4x4 oceanic record of 24.57 seconds. Also the Megamink single and average oceanic record of 34.6 for the single and 42.03 for the average. Sebastian Weir got a 4x4 average world record of 23.03. So last podcast where it was like the big 4x4 crazy weekend, pretty much all of that just got broken again. There was a 3x3 blindfold single world record of 18.31 seconds. And then I have to give a big shout out to Pedro Alejandro Cando Tellez, hope I pronounced that correctly, who set the South American record for 5x5 average of 59.1 seconds, 6x6 single of minute 50, 6x6 mean of minute 54, 7x7 single of 2 minutes 27 seconds, and the 7x7 mean of 2 minutes and 38 seconds. So huge day for that person as well. So before we go to the interview, I'm going to answer some of the questions that were submitted. Remember, if you want to submit questions of your own, go to speedcubereview.com/podcast, and there will be an entry form right there. You can also just go to SpeedCubeReview and hit the podcast tab. That's also where you can answer the question to win the next giveaway. Now, I have one question I'm going to talk about first. Brent from the Philippines that says, "Hey Sean, love your videos and your CFAP tutorial, very useful for us. I hope I win and thank you." That is not how you win anything. You might win if the goal is to get on the podcast, but that's not where you enter for the giveaway. There's a separate question for the giveaway. This is just the contact form to ask questions for me. Rick from the Netherlands, how do you store your SpeedCube Shop lube? I always put the black caps on, but then I don't know which blue cap is for what lube, and it gets really sluggish if you put the caps on the wrong one. I think he's talking about the extra adapter they can put on the syringe to have it come out in smaller amounts. Honestly, I don't even really use the smaller syringe anymore, but I just keep them separate. After I'm done using it, I clean them out, so I use like a paper clip to kind of wipe a lot of that out and rinse them out, just because also it can get gunky either way, no matter what thickness it is. So if you're using those adapters you can put on the syringe, just clean them out each time, and I think you should be good. Aaron from Wisconsin asks, what do you think about Team FMC? Would you like to see this in competitions? I guess I actually have never even thought about Team FMC. I feel like if that was a thing, it would have to be organized a different way, because there'd be a lot of chatting and a lot of people hearing other people's ideas with things. So it could be good, but I don't see it for a competition. Amando from Illinois says, I currently use beginner method for the first 2 layers, but I use 2-look OLL and 2-look PLL. I want to get much faster, but I'm not so sure where to start. Should I learn F2L, 1-look OLL, or PLL? If you think I should learn F2L, then should I start with intuitive or algorithms? So, first off, my answer is just all of it. I mean, I feel like learning F2L and learning PLL or OLL are kind of 2 different things. Start with intuitive. Do pretty much all of it intuitive. There are some weird cases, but other than some of those weird cases, intuitive is much better. One reason is that it's just much easier to remember the movements and the algorithms and the patterns, but the other reason, and this people forget a lot of times, is that intuitive can be much more efficient than doing an algorithm. What I mean by that is algorithms often don't take in consideration open slots around the puzzle, and you can easily insert pieces with using those open slots. Now, I think this question was kind of answered in the last podcast, so I'm going to try to not repeat too many questions. Braden from Las Vegas asks, when do you usually make your podcasts? I really like your channel, but I don't know when your podcasts are. They're every other Wednesday is when they're going to be released, often Tuesday night, just because sometimes when I put on iTunes, I have to put it on early so they can process it and get it on there. But Wednesday, every other Wednesday. So this one will be out on July 5th. Next one should be out on July, if my math is correct, July 19th. Question from, I believe it's Pratap from Michigan. This question is for you, Sean. Oh, that's good, because that's me. I saw that you play violin as well, and are terrific at it. Thank you. I am wondering if you had any connection between the cube and the violin on some higher level. I'm trying to pursue both the hobbies at the same time, trying to somewhat connect some of the dots between them. I guess solving Rubik's Cube is mostly right brain activity, and violin requires creativity plus some sort of scales, hence including both parts of the brain. What is your comment on that? First off, that whole right brain, left brain thing, that's not a real thing. That's, before we had an understanding of the brain, people just sort of threw that out there, and it's not an actually scientific thing. It's, people perpetuate that by talking about right brain and left brain. That's not how the brain works. As far as how they're connected, they're almost identical in a lot of respects, where when you're learning algorithms, you're learning movements. You're learning, you're trying to get into your muscle memory, and you're not trying to remember R prime, U, L prime, and all those different things like that. When you're doing scales, it's the same exact thing. At first, yeah, you have to know where the finger placement is and what notes you're playing, but your goal is to get it into your muscle memory so you're not actually having to do that every single time, and your muscles are doing those movements that you've done over and over again. So scales and algorithms are almost identical in that respect. If you're playing an instrument and improvising, you're using a basic structure. When you improvise, you're usually not just playing completely random notes. You have some sort of structure you're following and trying to fill in certain gaps, whether it's chord progressions, things like that. And I feel like F2L is a lot like that. You have an end goal, and there's just many different ways of getting there. So there's a lot of different ways that it is similar. The big thing is muscle development and just understanding the basic hand-eye coordination with that. I plan on making a big video about this later on, but that is a good question. Now I have actually a similar question from Michael in Alabama talking about violin as well. That says, I know you like to try new things. Do you try new techniques or types of music just for fun? Can you contrast the violin practice versus how you practice cubing? So, okay, that's actually in the same boat. As far as practicing, I have a video in the works about practicing with it, but a quick little note on that, if you're practicing, do not focus on just doing solve after solve after solve. It's kind of like practicing the violin or any other instrument and just playing the song over and over and over and over again. You have to break it down and to really work on things, work on certain techniques just slowly. As far as learning new types of music, definitely. I, just a couple months ago, for the first time, was asked to come in and do improvisation over some like popular music during an exercise class. I also randomly joined a honky-tonk band on accident. That was a complete accident, but it was something that I just pursued because it was something new I've never done before. Alexander from South Australia asked, Alexander from South Australia asked, on the last podcast you mentioned Hoya. Is Hoya your main method for big cubes, or is it Yao? Thanks. Well, it depends on what one. For 4x4 and 5x5, definitely Hoya. 6x6 and up, I usually just go to reduction. But no, I don't like Yao. I think I prefer Hoya over Yao. For 4x4, I feel like, actually for almost any of them, I feel like it's equally as efficient. And for me, looking head on Hoya is much easier. I think the reason Yao is more popular, one, because it's older, and two, because it's older in that same respect, you see more people using it, which then makes more people think that it's better, which makes more people do it. So there can be a whole nother debate on Hoya and Yao, and if you just like search for it, you can see a bunch of opinions on forums and places like that. Okay, and the final question until we get to the interview, I can't pronounce this name, and actually they don't even put a location, so I'm just going to go to the question. Hey, what glue should I use for magnetizing a cube? Because some people say superglue eats through plastic. Thanks. Superglue does not eat through plastic. I don't know what superglue they're talking about, but just the superglue that is like right in front of me right now says it's for plastics. It's great for plastics. And actually, there are some superglue that's specifically for plastic. But no, I just use the Gorilla Impact Tough superglue. I've had zero issues with any superglue. I've used that. I've used Crazy Glue. I know there's some bottles that actually have brushes on them, which might even make it really easy to apply the glue. But no, superglue does not eat plastic. And actually, I saw an image where I know the Cubicle uses Gorilla Glue as well. So yeah, that's completely fine. Okay, so now that we're done with questions, let's go right off to the interview. Hey, I'm here with Ian Sheffler, the author of Cracking the Cube. Thank you for being on the podcast.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so kind of just start things off, very general question I'm sure you've answered a ton of times already, but what led to the writing of this book? What was the big catalyst for making this happen?
Well, I suppose the big catalyst there's a long answer to this question, and then there's a shorter answer to this question, but since it's a podcast and I guess, we can go on for a little bit, I'll give you like the legit answer, which is that the real catalyst was in 2005. I went to this nerdy little summer camp called the Center for Talented Youth, and had the good fortune of sitting next to Toby Mao, the younger brother of Tyson Mao, the co-founder of the World Cube Association. And at the time I was like 14 years old. And, I think like a lot of people in my generation, which is no longer the youngest generation, which is a whole other bizarre thing now. I don't even use anyway. That's something to talk about later. But I knew what a cube was, right? Because I was born in 1990, which means that I missed the 80s by like close to a year. But I just knew what the cube was, right? It's like in the culture to such a degree that you can't grow up and really not have seen it to some extent.
Oh yeah.
And I also knew it was really hard. Like the first time I ever tried to solve it, I think, was in the late 90s at a science museum gift store. And I got a keychain version, which was, some kind of knockoff with like glittery purple and gold and orange stickers. Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming it's a knockoff, or else at the time there was just a really kind of like horrendously stickered version circulating as a keychain model. But anyway, I didn't know it was a puzzle. I sort of replicated Mr. Rubik's own experience of like, oh, wow, this is so pretty. Oh, my God, look at all the different patterns I can make. And then, at a certain point, it gets pretty jumbled up. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll just go back to the beginning. And then like I couldn't. And then I just got frustrated and put it aside. I'm like, oh, this is never going to work out. There goes a really pretty keychain. Oh, well. And I think I like kept it on my backpack actually when I went to school as a kid, just because it looked cool. Yeah. Like I didn't know what to do with it. But anyways, so I sat next to this kid on the first day. I didn't know him from Adam. But I learned he could solve a Rubik's Cube because that's what he was just doing literally nonstop under the table during class. So much so that our teacher banned cubes from the classroom. Of course, immediately made Toby super cool because he was already an outlaw from the very beginning of camp. And so we all then had to get Rubik's Cubes. So I went to like a novelty store. Mm-hmm. I think the first weekend of this experience, it was like a 3-week summer camp. And when I say nerd camp, it was like the kind of camp where it's school in the summer for fun. So we were all taking a writing class, and I got a cube and brought it to camp. And like, it was almost this is going to make me sound real old because, I was around when Pokemon was like a thing for the first time. And I remember like being on the playground in the 90s, and you weren't cool if you didn't have a cool Pokemon card, or like how cool you were depended to some extent on if you had like a shiny Charizard.
Oh yes, I remember those times.
Yeah, exactly. So I was lucky enough at one point to get a shiny Charizard. So I knew what it was like, and I didn't want to be on the losing end of that battle. So I went and got a cube. It was like Rubik's 25th anniversary edition or something like that. It had like, instead of a white side, it had like a silver foil side, which was kind of neat. And for a cube back then that was out of the box, it was actually pretty decent in terms of not being impossible to turn. And I learned how to solve it from Toby, and I thought that was the end of the story. But then in 2012, when I was finishing up at university, I got wind that there was going to be a national championship, which was the first time I'd ever heard about competitions outside of that summer camp, because, we would just race each other for fun. And Toby would always win. I mean, he was like the top dog, and we were all just trying to catch up. I never broke a minute, but I got close. Anyways, I noticed that Toby was one of the staffers. This led me to the WCA website, and sort of I was like, oh, what's this? And so we reconnected after years of having fallen out of touch. And I asked him what was going on, and he explained a little bit about what the WCA was and how he was connected to it, and that his brother had co-founded it. And then I asked if I could write something about it, because I was sort of a writerly person who had ambitions in that direction. I'd, been interning at magazines and stuff, and he got kind of offended, frankly, and basically said, what do you mean? Like, how can you write about it if you're not going to compete? And he was totally right. And so that kind of started this process of, like, the more I learned about cubing, the more interested I got, and the more I realized that there were just questions that hadn't been answered before. I mean, I think if you ask folks who spent as much time writing a book as I did, because it was a project that I budgeted 5 years for, and it took about 4.5. I had all these questions that just didn't have answers, and I think you have to have something like that to motivate you if you're going to spend that long on something. And, there were these questions that had sort of been answered, but also not really. It was just these basic things like, well, where did the cube come from, and why was it invented, and what's so engrossing about it that people still do it today, even when there's myriad opportunities to, do stuff on the internet. And also, perhaps first of all, how does anyone do it so fast? And that was something that I started to be able to understand just by doing it. So it was just basically this bizarre series of happenstances that made me aware that cubing was even a thing. And then once I started looking into it, it became clear that, well, I mean, again, if there had been this exact book, I wouldn't have written it, but it was sort of one of those moments of, like, you wind up writing the book that you want to read because it just doesn't exist.
So was there a direct audience you were writing it for?
Well, the hope anyway is that this is the kind of book that cubers can look at and be like, oh, okay, I can see myself in this book. I can relive the experience of falling in love with cubing. And also it's someplace I can go to learn about the history of my own sport in terms of, where did it come from? How did it develop, both in terms of the puzzle's history and also the history of the sport and the early, cubers who made a mark, who made the WCA possible. And, obviously, I think if you look at the numbers, like, cubing is getting actually younger every year. I remember, I think talking to Ron Van Broekum, or I don't remember if this was data that was publicly available on the WCA site or that I obtained some other way, but I'm pretty sure the average age now of WCA members is 14 years old or something like that. And it has, fallen recently. So it's a really young activity. And, I've met folks who've never heard of Tyson Mao, even though he's one of the co-founders. Just, since he's retired, I guess they don't know about him. And it's been, 11 years since that, I think what I would consider the first major cube appearance in modern media, which was the cube in the Will Smith film, The Pursuit of Happiness. So, I thought that this book could both be something cubers themselves could learn something about their own sport about, and also hopefully something that, if you're someone who's just, at the bookstore and you've or browsing on Amazon, you've come across, just videos. Maybe you have a niece or nephew who's really into it and you don't quite understand why, or you saw something in the news or on YouTube that, was about, someone breaking a world record, and you were like, oh, wow, maybe you grew up with the cube in the 80s and you had no idea it was still around, or you had a tangential sense that kids were getting into it and you didn't really understand why. Well, a big reason I wrote the book was to try to understand why the cube has endured so long. So, the hope is that it's something both cubers and non-cubers can get something out of.
Yeah, I mean, because I picked up the book, there is a lot of things that, like, some things I recognize, and I was like, oh, I remember that, and I could, like, there's little things that, like, the T-Noodle app that I recently used it a lot because I was working on FMC, and just, there was, like, a little thing in there about how it got its name, and for some reason that just, like, blew my mind. I was like, oh, that's so cool to actually know that now. But there was one part, you were backstage with Mats and Felix, was it Worlds 2015? 2013?
I think 2013 in Vegas.
Okay, so I guess, like, what I'm picturing in my mind is, like, this really secluded backstage green room with, like, Mats, Felix, and you, and, like, a fruit tray or something. Was it, like, were you back there because you're writing the book, or was it just, like, other people could be back there? What was that situation, I guess, like?
Oh, well, that was, yeah, I mean, that was a fun chapter to write, actually. I had so many notes from that experience, because basically I was just hiding in the corner, just like a fly on the wall, trying not to disturb them, but also, like, you know, gather the scene, because it was sort of, you know, in my mind anyway, kind of like the Ali Frazier of cubing competitions up to that point. Also, that's a reference that may get lost on folks who are listening, but it was an important boxing match once upon a time when boxing was a mainstream activity. Anyways, you know, between two major heavyweight contenders. Anyways, one of the things that made this project unique is that I was personally involved in terms of I you know, had known Toby when we were kids and we'd reconnected, and so going to the World Championships, you know, I had gotten to know most of the sort of higher up, the organizers. I mean, cubing is not very hierarchical. It's extremely egalitarian, but, you know, the people who were running the show, so to speak, and they basically said, yeah, it's okay to, you know, wander around. And if people are, if people are okay with it, it's totally fine for you to, you know, go backstage and check it out. It was not something that just anyone in the competition was doing. And I think the whole point was that the green room is like a chance for them to just calm their nerves, which again is why I was literally in the corner trying to be as unobtrusive as possible, just like quietly taking notes, which at the end of the day could have been more obtrusive if someone had looked up and been like, what is that man doing here? This is very strange. But in my memory, basically no one noticed. I mean, Kevin Hayes was just eating some like takeout from the Chinese restaurant in the food court. It's also weird to think about how the book actually records moments of recent history in cubing that were fairly significant, right? Like Felix winning his first world title, you know, when he left that green room, and it was the whole +2 incident where Mats would potentially have won if he hadn't gotten that +2. And that almost feels like ancient history, because the venue where it happened, it literally doesn't exist anymore. The Riviera Hotel and Casino. You know, I mean, I was just thinking back to the Kevin Hayes sitting there eating his, this is like, I don't know, it was like orange chicken or something from the Chinese restaurant. And I mean, to me, that was an interesting just moment to bear witness to, because it really made it, you know, at the time I was really just kind of scratching the surface in terms of getting into cubing, and my own abilities were even less. I mean, not to say I'm a remarkable cuber. I average under 20 seconds, but you know, these days that's certainly never going to win you a competition, and rarely makes it to the second round. Anyways, you know, I was still in the process of understanding how cubing is and isn't like other sporting activities. And this was one of those moments that just seemed, I don't know, like if I'd been a documentary filmmaker, it would have just been gold in terms of like, you know, you've got all these people who are about to compete on stage kind of like staring each other in the face and sort of trying to, you know, break the ice with these, you know, terrible jokes and things like that. I remember, you know, some of the banter fell on dead ears, because Felix, for instance, was just like hardcore listening to music and just practicing and paying attention to nothing or almost nothing. I mean, he's an extremely polite, really wonderful person. And so I think at some point he might have taken his headphones off and responded. I can't remember the moment verbatim at this point, but there were some moments where, you know, Mats might have tried to sort of break the ice a bit, and then Felix just didn't notice, and it got very awkward, and Mats was like, okay, I'll just go back to cubing now. Which to me, it's like, you know, those are the kind of funny moments that like I had cut my teeth as an intern at the New Yorker in college, and as far as the kind of style of nonfiction I really admired and learned from, it often had scenes like that of like, the writer goes somewhere that maybe the casual viewer doesn't have a chance to see and brings back something that reads like a little scene out of a play or something, or it's just like an interesting moment that shows people as characters aside from the various numbers or accomplishments you attach to their names.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. And you were talking about how even like that venue doesn't exist. So much has changed in cubing. Like this is such a like I got into cubing 3 years ago, and from then until now is just this constant changing of puzzles that are out, cubers that are around, even just like rule changes, things like that. So I guess, is there anything that while writing you had to go back and alter, or anything now that you would like to go back and either add or change something?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest thing that comes to mind is I assume that most people listening to this will know who Max Park is. He's like the current number one ranked cuber for 3x3 average, world record holder. Well, recently was the world record holder for 4x4 average. I think that was won back by Felix or Sebastian now. And he still is the world record holder for OH average. I sat at one of my early competitions. I mean, so that was actually, so let me back up a second.
Okay.
It was a big discussion I kind of had with myself about like, should this book be how to structure a book like this? Because there have been a number of books about kind of quirky competitive subcultures. There's been one about, I mean, there was, for instance, just to give 3 examples, there's like, Word Freak about the world of competitive Scrabble, which came out in 2001. There's Moonwalking with Einstein about the world of memory competitions, which came out in like 2011, I want to say. Mm-hmm. And then there was, a book about the Spelling Bee, the Scripps National Spelling Bee, which came out, I think, in the mid 2000s. And they all the Scrabble and memory ones took an approach of like, making the author a participant and the central character, where like you sort of learn about this world as the author attempts to achieve a certain goal within it. Mm-hmm. And then the Spelling Bee book was different, where, unless it's that sort of bizarre Jason Bateman movie, I think it's Jason Bateman, the guy who was in Arrested Development, where like, he exploits some bizarre rule about like, he never finished the 8th grade, so he can totally join the Spelling Bee, even though he's like a 40-year-old man. No actual adult writer could go join the Spelling Bee and write about it, because to be in the Spelling Bee, you can't be past the 8th grade. Mm-hmm. So what this person did was just have like sort of several long chapters about the stories of different contestants, like showing you their background, why they got into it, their family life, like what motivates them, their training, and then sort of concluding with like them together at the Bee. And so I was trying to think, like, I spent a long time futzing around, like, well, does it make sense to pick certain cubers and tell their stories? And what I ultimately realized is, like, I couldn't be in multiple places at once, and like cubing had so many sides to it, so to speak, that like it felt like it wouldn't be representative of the whole world, or it wouldn't touch on all the sides of it that I wanted to touch, to say just follow the story of Felix or Mats, or like fill in any cuber's name you want, because every cuber, I think what was interesting for me was seeing all the parallels, where like by meeting so many different cubers in so many countries, by talking to so many people, I think I got a better sense of what does make cubing special. Why is cubing of interest? Why is the cube sort of back, so to speak? Or maybe you could say why it never went away for people who actually, who cube. Mm-hmm. So this is all to say that if I were to go back, if I were writing it today, I might do something different, where like, so I happened to actually sit next to Max Park when I was his judge for his first sub 10 average at Nisei Week, which is this lovely competition that happens every fall in downtown Los Angeles. And that I went to as an early competition. I think I got close to getting my first sub 30 average there, but I think I messed it up. So I didn't get a sub 30 average, but anyway, I remember sitting next to him, and he's had just this incredible meteoric rise. I mean, he's got just a very compelling story about, it generally takes much longer for someone to really make a big mark in cubing at this point, because the times have gotten so fast. Yeah. And so I would definitely want to, feature him as a character, because that was a moment, cubing is a small enough world that if you hang enough around it, you're going to just brush shoulders with these incredible people. Like, well, that's another thing that seems to be in the process of slowly changing, and perhaps reasonably so, in terms of, cutoff times and qualifications and stuff like that, the sort of gradual separating of, the more professional class of cubers and then everybody else who's doing it more recreationally. And that's definitely something that I was trying to sort of capture in the book, or I think just was captured by the sheer fact of it, that like, cubing is a radically egalitarian sport in that it's competitive, but also collaborative, where like, no one's being a mean sport or trying to put anybody else down or sort of win at the expense of anyone. It's, I think you can sort of see a great example of this in the rivalry of Mats and Felix, in terms of they're fierce competitors when they're on stage, but they're really good friends when they're off it. And Max's story certainly fits into that mold, in the sense of like, I think the first thing that, Felix did after, Max broke his, world record average was congratulate him, and talk about how he considers Max Park a legend, right?
Yeah, he posted, it was like Twitter, Instagram, somewhere, that he posted a picture of him with Max when he was younger, talking about his photo with his idol. So yeah. And I assume that's like a little bit tongue in cheek, but it also clearly is true, in the sense that like no one knows better than Felix how hard it is to get that fast, right? Like I think he once told me, because I think I was being a little starry-eyed about like, wow, dude, you're so fast, and he's like, well, yeah, but if you think about it, took me a long time to get here. It's not some kind of overnight sensation. He pointed out, like, it took him, maybe it took him 2 months or whatever to go sub 20, but then it took like literally years to get to just, from 10 seconds to like 8 seconds, or just below 8 at the time. And, I figure, someone like him, understands better than anybody how incredible it is what Max has done. So, he's definitely someone I would include. And then I would also, want to maybe, because the cube stores obviously play a big role in the lives of all cubers, in the sense that like, we all kind of have our own allegiances to like, which store do we like, where do we buy our cubes, because everyone's always getting cubes. And I met Cameron Brown at my first competition. It runs Speed Cube Shop. And I really enjoyed getting to talk to him and sort of share the story of how, he started this business when he was basically just a teenager, and it's really taken off. It's like a legit business, as he sort of said, a little incredulous to me. He's like, yeah, it's real. We pay taxes and everything. And he was a minor when he was saying that. So he was really ahead of the curve in terms of, running a real business. But I think I would have wanted to include some additional stories as well about, Phil Yu and the Cubicle, Eric Zhao and Cube Depot, just because they all have slightly different stories that I think are interesting. A lot of people are familiar with the Cubicle to a pretty high degree because of their all the videos they do, Chris, their sort of cult of personality around Chris Tran. Like Chris would have been a really fun character to include. But I think in a funny way, if I were starting the book now, I guess I would do those things. But I also, I'm happy to look back and, having started cubing when I did, or seriously cubing, not just knowing how to solve a cube in 2012. It's like, well, whatever. I'm happy for it to stand as and again, it's bizarre to think about this because it only came out in hardback like 6 months ago. I guess I'm happy for it to stand as a record of the period that I wrote it about, because, I remember meeting Phil Yu at the Riviera, speaking of that place, pretty much right around the time he'd launched Cubicle, and it was, pretty new, and he was like a law student at Georgetown, and, back when he was real serious about OH. So that dates this a little bit. But yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah. So, just a couple more quick things. There some people have written in some questions. First one, we were talking about, or in the book, so you met with Jessica Friedrich, and it seemed she was completely unaware of what times have gotten today. So this is a very, I guess, simple question. Do you think at this point she's aware now of what times have gotten to?
Oh, I think partly because I told her. I mean, she wasn't kidding, I think, when she said that, like, cubing was something she didn't really actively do anymore. I mean, it was, the last, I think, competition she actually competed at was the 2003 World Championships, where she came in second overall. And I mean, it makes sense when you consider that, like, she started cubing as a teenager in the 80s.
Yeah.
And that was a pretty long time ago. So I don't know how actively she sort of keeps up to date. I sent her a copy of the book as a thank you for taking the time to meet with me. And, you know, in the process of, I mean, if you look at that interview transcript, you're exactly right. It's like, she was really blown away. She's like, wow, I didn't know. And, you know, the only way you wouldn't know is if you just didn't go to any cubing site or anything. But in some ways, I think that's kind of charming in the sense that, you know, different generations of cubers, in some ways, I guess, because, you know, if someone sort of drops out of cubing, their experience is a bit of a time capsule of like what it was like when they cubed.
Yeah.
And, you know, for everything from her website, which is like straight up just like super 90s, like flashing graphics, you know, to her own experience, stands as sort of a testament to what cubing was like back then. So you know, when I met with her, the world record average was like 7.54, I think. And now it's down to like, you know, 6.39. So that's a much less of a difference than, you know, when I think the world record average was, you know, much closer to 20 seconds, which was around the time of the, you know, the 03 World. So I assume she'd be less surprised now because, you know, that's not as big a difference.
Yeah. And one more. So in the book, there's a couple times there's different musical references. Like there's talking about and this was fun to look up. I think it's Ryan Oldham. He has a piece called Symphony for Wind Ensemble that was created through pitches from the Rubik's Cube. And then and this is actually, it's funny. I use this. I've talked to so many of my violin, because I teach violin, and I use Rubik's Cube as an example for scales. Like I was like, it's just like when I memorize these algorithms, and so like in the book it says memorizing algorithms I was discovering is a lot like memorizing scales. First you ache to pick one, there are scores of different options for every case. And so I guess since there's so many musical references, are you a musician?
Yeah, so I was actually I was a pretty serious musician in the sense that I devoted a lot of time to it from I guess starting in grade school until I entered college, because I was lucky enough to go to a public school district that had a pretty serious music program, which just kind of started in the 4th grade when we all got handed out this little brochure with, you know, like Snoopy playing his trumpet on it as a cartoon. And they listed all the different instruments that you could study. And my mom had a small hand in it where, like, she didn't, she was a school teacher, and she'd seen all the kids, you know, lugging around cellos that were like the size of them. And, you know, she wanted something a little more portable, and I also liked talking a lot, and she thought, well, if I just stick a wind instrument in his mouth, you know, he will be able to just produce sounds. And so I wound up picking the clarinet, and I played clarinet from the 4th grade until I finished high school, and I got to play in Walt Disney Concert Hall. My high school orchestra did a tour of China. I did some, like, you know, all-state honor orchestra, honor band, stuff like that, did some marching band. Played a lot of solo clarinet repertoire, a lot of chamber music. I actually did a back of the envelope calculation when I sort of lessened my involvement, because I reached this point where it was like, you know, either, and I suppose anyone reaches this point with anything they pursue, whether it's cubing or music or anything else, there was a point of, you know, deciding how seriously you're going to pursue this in life, because if you want to keep getting better, you're going to have to devote more time to it, which means you're going to have to do less of everything else. And what I really wanted to do, what I was most passionate about, was writing. I mean, I sort of reached this peak moment in like 10th grade where we got to have a whole, my high school orchestra, again, it was a public school district in LA that was just very serious about music. You know, we literally got to do an entire concert by ourselves. Like, we were the only thing in the program at Walt Disney Concert Hall in LA, which is the home of the LA Philharmonic, which is one of the world's great orchestras. And we did a couple pieces. We did Tchaikovsky's Little Russian Symphony. We did this Rimsky-Korsakov overture. I just can't remember the name of it right now. And we also did all of George Gershwin's An American in Paris, and I played bass clarinet on that. So I got to have this like really awesome solo in Walt Disney Concert Hall, which was really fun. Yeah, it was a really great piece. So that was really fun. And then we also went to China and like played some exchange concerts and public concerts, and that was a crazy experience that I could devote a whole podcast to. But anyways, at the end of that year, I sort of realized, like, okay, is probably the peak for me, because I don't want to be a professional musician in any sense. And so my involvement started tapering from there. But, by the end of it, I sort of, and I still actively listen to a lot of music, even though I don't play. I hope also, if I become a parent one day, I'm definitely going to, my kids will have the option of, I think, choosing what instrument they play, but they're going to have to try something. I hope that doesn't sound bad, but it's just music gave me so much in life that I think it's great to do for anybody. Because, I'm someone who doesn't actively play music anymore, even though I do still have my clarinet, because it's a nice clarinet. I went through this whole thing, like, with my clarinet teacher. I mean, the world of clarinet is almost as specific and bizarre as the world of cubing, just as any world is if you get involved enough. Like, clarinets are all made of this one particular wood, the grenadilia tree, which is getting rarer. So I suppose that clarinet is a bit like maybe hiding gold in your closet or something. At least that's the hope. But, picking it was almost like getting a wand at Ollivanders and Harry Potter, where, they pull out like 40 different clarinets, which in theory are all exactly the same. But, because it's this instrument made of wood, it's like they all sound a little different. They all, respond a little differently to you. And it was exactly like Harry Potter, where like, oh, that wand isn't quite doing it for you. And this one, maybe a few sparks, and then you find the one for you. You're like, that's the one for me. And my clarinet teacher was British, so that extended the metaphor even further, where she'd be like, I don't think that one's quite right. And, this one's got a nice tone to it. So it was very Harry Potter-esque, and I've got really a lot of fond memories. But the real important thing is that, I don't think I would have actually gotten into cubing if I hadn't played music seriously, because what music taught me is, it's discipline, right? It's like just sort of the pedagogical skills of like learning something new, where it's like, okay, how are you going to, if you have something as complex as like a piece of music that you have to learn, or that you want to learn, you could compare it to learning to write a screenplay, or learning to solve differential equations, or learning to solve the cube. You take a big task and then you break it into smaller tasks, where it's like, okay, you sight read the whole thing through. It's horrendous. Let's go back and let's work on the first, 10 bars. Okay, we've got to get the rhythm down. Let's look on that. It's the process of learning how to get good at something, right? Like that. That's something that music taught me. It taught me discipline, because as I'm finally getting to here, I did this back of the envelope calculation, where I think I calculated that from kindergarten to 12th grade, I spent something like 15,000 hours in public school, just day to day in school, not counting homework. And then I did about 5,000 hours of music was my rough calculation when you throw in practicing and everything else. So what I realized is, for every minute I spent in public school from kindergarten to 12th grade, I played about a third of a minute of music. And I was like, wow, that's a lot. Like, that's a lot of time to spend doing something. And at the end of the day, it gave me kind of a lifelong set of skills, not only an interest in listening to music and playing music. Funny story, I was at the opera recently, and I'm not a huge opera buff, but it's something I'd like to learn more about. And they had a Q&A where I think it's too bad that, that this is the case, but the opera house was trying to get young kids in, so they had, or younger people like me, and they had like this really cheesy trivia session called La Triviata to precede La Traviata. And it was kind of a roll your eyes moment, but like, the questions were kind of fun and you could win some prizes. But anyways, yeah, so that's all sort of a very roundabout way of answering. I don't consider myself an active musician, but I can certainly sing. I'm a huge fan of theater, and especially musicals. I'm a big fan of Hamilton the musical. And I somehow managed to get tickets last year, but wow. I bought, that's a whole story in and of itself. But I actually bought the sheet music, because you can buy like a book that includes like, piano and voice for a lot of the major songs. And I really want to learn piano just so I can like recruit friends and be like, we're going to do this now for fun, as opposed to just me singing to myself on the, in my head on the subway.
It's interesting too, with just even relating cubing and music. Like there's not so many teachers, but there's, music is something that there's teachers and you learn, and they talk about how there's practicing, and, you should enjoy practicing, but there's steps, what you should do and how to practice. And I feel like there's not so much that with cubing. People I always hear people talking about how they're at home trying to get the fastest solve and they just can't do it, as if they're constantly competing. And it's this almost, I think that might be the next step of maybe where I need to go, is make it like a teaching base like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's as anyone who reads the book will find out. Like that's basically, you know, the goal I set myself, or rather that Toby set me years ago, was to go sub 20, and you know, back when that was really, really, really hard, and you know, obviously it's still non-trivial. And that's exactly the way I approached it, was as if I were learning something, you know, that was music related. You know, like seek out good teachers, you know, learn what they have to basically perform for them, and then they, you know, critique you. Like I remember getting to have what I would call, you know, sort of like a master class with Felix at the World Championships in Brazil. And it was one of those moments where it's like, if I were to compare it to clarinet, like there's this famous, very kind of like gruff clarinet teacher in Los Angeles who teaches at USC named Yehuda, who's Israeli. And he's known for being very just like blunt to the point of being almost seeming mean. And you know, you have to be at a certain level. I never took a class with him because I never quite reached that level. But like, I had one classmate growing up who was really phenomenal. He's an amazing musician named James Hodges. And like, even when we were in high school, he'd really reached the level of like, he was, you know, taking lessons with this guy Yehuda, who was like, you know, teaching master students at USC. And that was almost what it was like to take a you know, have a little workshop with Felix where like I demonstrated a solve for him. And I was like, okay, what do you think I can improve on? And he was trying to be as polite as possible. And he's like, well, like, I mean, it's the same solve that I would do. It's just slower. And I was like, oh, and I'm just like, so what do I do? He's like, well, if you just like the moves are fine, but if you just execute them faster. And like, you know, I think that solve, you know, at that time I was averaging around, you know, like low 20s. And so literally he's like, yeah, I would do the same thing. I would just do it basically at 3 times the speed. And so I was just like, all right, well, I guess I'll just practice more then. You know, I mean, some other times when I had reached out to him, he had very great specific, you know, he had specific advice about slow turning, or sort of like, you know, here's what I would recommend, you know, as sort of how to get better at F2L and stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think that using those pedagogical skills for music, it's enormously helpful if you want to learn anything, whether it's like, you know, how to be a professional kayaker, or like, you know, how to skateboard, you know, is a great example. I grew up, it's funny, I never made the parallel growing up. I was a bad skateboarder, but I was an obligatory skateboarder because I grew up in Southern California, and you just, you know, once you enter middle school, they hand you a skateboard and they're like, give it a try or else you're not cool, you know? And if I had actually broken it down that way, instead of just fruitlessly trying again and again to like grind a rail before even properly knowing how to like ollie on the board, I would have had much more success. And so with cubing, it was actually a whole process of like kind of unlearning bad habits and then learning better habits. Like I actually injured, to me anyway, in retrospect, it's funny. I injured myself in the process of trying to go sub 20. I got a repetitive stress injury in my thumb, which I then learned is like a real thing, that back in the 80s, like there was a medical article about it in a very prestigious medical journal. And what I was doing is I was doing all these F turns with my thumb instead of just rotating the cube and using R and U turns. Like I just didn't understand how to be efficient. And, you know, honestly, that's not too different from, say, if you're a clarinet player, like learning that there's actually different fingerings, or if you're a violin player, like there's also different fingerings, and like, you know, there's a better way and a worse way to do this, you know? Anyway, yeah, I think you could draw parallels between cubing and music all day long. I think the one you started out with of scales and algorithms is great, because that's exactly what it is. It's just, these are the building blocks. And actually, whenever I talk to people, which is fairly often, who, you know, haven't heard about speed cubing and I want to introduce them to it, I will, and when they find, I'm like, you know, oh, guess how fast the world record is, and they'll be like, oh, like 3 minutes, and I'm like, no, it's faster. And then we just sort of play that game until they realize or until I tell them it's like, no, yeah, the world record's 4.73 seconds. Or at least is of this moment, you know, who knows what'll happen next weekend. But they're always amazed, and like, literally, how is that possible? I don't understand. And I said, well, it's sort of like jazz, right? Like, you ever heard jazz? And they're like, yeah. So I'm like, well, it's like improvisation. And, you know, but these people are like, you know, John Coltrane, like they're just great at it. Because I think that's actually, in my mind, like, you know, when I'm part of the reason I brought up the music metaphors in the book is like, you know, I tried to write this book in a way that would present cubing in a certain way to people who don't know much about it, which is that I had a lot of ideas about how I wanted to present it, but one of them is that I wanted to make it seem legitimate in the sense of like, this is not a frivolous waste of time, because having done it seriously, I know it's not, even though a lot of people might look at it and be like, oh, it's a kid's toy, or why is anyone doing this, especially, anyone who's not from the 80s. And it's like, no, there's actually something really of value that's legitimately very interesting from many different perspectives. And, music is something that's generally widely regarded as like something that's worth people's time, whether or not they choose to do it. So it's like, oh yeah, I don't think anyone in their right mind would be like, oh, I don't play music, I've never played music, it's not a worthwhile pursuit. Most people have a very great deal of respect for people who do music, even if they don't do it themselves. People listen to music, and a lot of people have tried to solve Rubik's Cube and failed. And so I wanted to, use some metaphors that would both be accurate and also, I think, confer an appropriate amount of showing that it's serious or legitimate, or it's not frivolous.
Okay. Yeah. Now, before we get to a few questions from listeners, you have a paperback coming out, and it should be, I think it's a week from when we're recording this, but it'll be like yesterday from when the podcast comes out. Is that correct? Is that the date?
Yep. On Monday, July 4th, I believe it is. Simon & Schuster, my publisher, is coming out with the paperback edition of the book, which differs in some small respects from the hardback. Most notably, we didn't quite anticipate exactly how young the audience would be for this book in terms of, I've had some really lovely interactions with, cubers who were, I guess in middle school. And so I think there were like a tiny, tiny number of blue words in the first one, which were just, literally quotes just from cubers who'd used some adult language. And it was very, very, in a book that has like 78,000 words in it, it was like 6 words. But we scrubbed those, so there's no concerns about it being an all-age book. And there is a nice blurb on the cover from Morgan Spurlock, the Oscar-nominated documentary filmmaker, who read the book and had some nice things to say about it. But otherwise, it is the same book, only cheaper, and in paperback. So you can kind of fold it if necessary to fit it in a backpack, or just, generally abuse it the way you do books around the house, and it will stand up to it and not look too bad.
And we're going to be giving away a couple. Is that true?
Yes, we are going to be giving away some, which I'm logistically, it should work out that I'd be able to sign them, and depending on the timing, hopefully able to sign them personally. It will, after listening to the podcast, those of you who are listening, you should go check it out.
Yeah, and I always say in the podcast where to go. It's at the speedcubereview.com website, and there'll be a question there to enter, but that'll be outside the show. Well, I'll plug that in before we do the interview part. And a couple quick questions. So this one's from Cameron Brown from Speedcube Shop. He asks, are you a Zhanchi or a Guhong kind of guy?
Oh my God, this is so old school. Also, I'm really touched that Cameron wrote in, but I feel like that's someone asking, like, do you like ascots or bow ties? Like, it's just such an old-fashioned thing at this point. Or like, do you like pocket squares or chains on your wallet? Like, I was always a Zhanchi person. I mean, I still have my Zhanchi, which is like, I didn't quite, it just still blows my mind that it's like practically a vintage item at this point. Like I visited some people in the book for researching the book, who I regrettably didn't get to really include to the degree I wanted, or the degree that I might have wanted, but it just didn't really fit the scope of the story. One of those is David Singmaster, who invented the notation we all use when we use algorithms. Singmaster's notation, like, are you, R prime, U prime, whatever. And he has probably the largest collection of Rubik's Cubes I've ever seen, in terms of, he just has acquired virtually every commercially available model. I don't know if he's really included speed cubes in that, but he's got like the Homer Simpson 2x2, where it's just like Homer's head that's bisected in different planes. He's got, the boob cube, which is like, you fill in the blank there. He's got all these sort of, I think he's got a long history of cubes going back to the early days, wooden one, he's bought some wooden ones, etc. And I don't think he had a Zhanchi at that point, but like, I feel a bit like him when I think about the fact that I own a Zhanchi and I still have the box. Like, it's a raggedy box, but it's still got that box. Like, I don't know. I remember I got it because when I first got into speed cubing, all I had still were my like name brand Rubik's cubes, which is what I started out learning to solve on.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd done enough solves that like the stickers had almost all peeled off. So I remember I still have it. I think I started taking it apart just to understand how it got put back together, and the mechanism is just so restrictive that like I struggle to put it back together. I think the silver one I first started out on. So many stickers have peeled off that it's a bit guesswork. Like I think there's two edge pieces that are orange, that have the other side almost totally rubbed off. And so you just kind of have to, like, you're solving it and you're like, okay, now which side does that go on? Because also some of the center pieces have rubbed off. So it really requires like, it's almost like being an archaeologist trying to like, imagine how some like, femur bone can help you extrapolate to like what kind of hominid this was and how tall they were and what age they died and all that stuff. But it's like, all right, now which side does this belong on? Well, based on these 4 other factors, I think we can confidently say this is the blue side, or something like that. So I have that's where I started out on when then I became aware, thanks to Toby, who taught me that like, speed cubes are a thing. And so I think I just bought my first Zanchi off of Amazon. Cameron was the first person I met who was like a speed cube owner. And so then I got more puzzles from him. And, at this point I've got, I don't know, like, at least 15 different, not all of them are the different models, but I've got probably a dozen different 3x3s, ranging from like, a Yushin, which I got after Colin set the world record, and suddenly that became obsolete like yesterday. But it was so cool because it had a dragon on the box, which I thought was awesome. But I sort of miss how like I don't know if this is still a thing, but I think I certainly looked into for the Zanchi that like Da King Bao, the designer, was making a reference to like some famous Taoist classics in the names of the puzzles. Like Zanchi apparently in Chinese means spread wings. And like, and if anyone later finds out this is not correct, feel free to correct me. I'm pretty sure it's the case that like Zanchi means spread wings, and it makes reference to this famous Taoist sort of story about, the creation of the world and a bird that's like so large that when it spreads its wings, it's like, larger than the earth or something like that. And I just thought it was so cool that he had A, designed a really neat puzzle, and B, put in this like little reference. Like as a former English major, I really live for stuff like that. But yeah, it was a good puzzle. I mean, if I lube my Zanchi up, it still works just fine. I don't know. It's almost like, and I'm probably going on way too long, and it shows how nostalgic I am for that puzzle. But like, I tried, I certainly tried Guhongs. I never owned them, but for me, firing up that old Zanchi is almost like I once visited some family friends in Connecticut, and they live in this little old town that like hasn't aged in 50 years. And they had a car that was like a fully restored car that was so old. It was from when cars didn't have seatbelts. And because they had been very historically accurate in their renovation of the car, it also didn't have seatbelts. Like it had just those huge fat white tires and like large shiny hubcaps. I remember getting in the car and thinking like, there's no way this is safe. And they're like, well, it's period accurate. And I'm like, well, I don't know if that's really worth it. And so that's sort of the feeling I have about the Zanchi now, where it's like, I definitely can get faster times if I'm using like a Volk, because it just turns better, not enormously better times, because again, I'm not like a 7-second cuber, but at the end of the day, right, it's the wizard who, makes the wand, or whatever the Harry Potter phrase is. So I actually remember a point I was solving at that point, a Wei Long, I think it was. And I like was at the World Championships getting that masterclass from Felix, and I handed him my cube to ask if he could demonstrate something. And it was really demoralizing how much faster he was with my cube. Like if anything underscored how it's really not the cube that makes you as fast as you are, it was seeing Felix suddenly pick up my cube and then my cube turn into the Usain Bolt of Rubik's Cubes. And I'm like, wow, I didn't know you could turn that fast. Like, you've never done that for me.
Like you're hoping it's like, that's a cube's fault and not yours. It's like...
or it's like you hope that like a little bit is the cube's fault, right? You're always like, well, if I just get the next best cube, I'll be a little better. And then just seeing how like, it went from like doing a 20-second solve in my fingers to being like, 8 seconds in his. So for, it's sort of the difference of like, I used to swim competitively, and, anyone who's old enough might remember like in 2009, there was this big controversy with like all the swimmers were using these like water repellent suits, which made you a lot faster. And, you know, I for some reason, you know, it was one of those things of like mail, that there was a swim catalog that had gotten my home address and would just send me random swim catalogs with like merchandise.
Mm-hmm.
And they would advertise like the same suits the Olympians wore, which were hundreds of dollars. They're incredibly expensive. And when I was on the high school swim team, I remember like, you know, there was one rival team that like, you know, had one pair of like the special shark skin style leggings that they would like trade among them during a relay. Like they just strip it off real quick and try to get on the next guy.
Mm-hmm.
And like, you know, at the level of like Michael Phelps, that makes a big difference, you know, because you're talking about tenths of a second or hundredths of a second. That's why, you know, that's why they shave all their body hair, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's why, you know, for people like Felix and Mats, you know, the exact cube you use can really matter a great deal because, you know, look, you know, right, you might win or lose a competition based on a hundredth of a second. But, you know, for everybody else, it's like, you know, clearly actually doing the work is what's going to make you faster, because it's, you know, it's like great, you know, Usain Bolt could literally jog in bare feet and be faster than me. Even, you know, I could be wearing the fanciest track shoes in the world. Anyway, big shout out to Cameron. You know, I have very fond memories of getting to interview him, getting to learn about speed cubes from him, and, you know, later getting a lot of puzzles from him. And yeah, I think I'll always be a Xanchi guy.
And because my 20 to 30 minute estimate for interview time is way out the window, I'm going to ask one more question from Underwater Cuber. This is from Instagram. He asks, when writing your book, did you learn any really cool things that you never knew about? And I'll kind of also rephrase that as what, I guess, was the biggest, or the coolest thing that you found out that you didn't know before you started writing the book?
Well, props to Underwater Cuber, because it's a very good question. But B, that's actually a really difficult question to answer, because there's so, like, for one, I'm the kind of person where it's like, you know, when I was a kid and it was like, what's your favorite toy? I'm like, well, that's my favorite. And that's also my favorite. This one is also my favorite. So I'm someone who has a hard time picking favorite anything, because to me, you know, different things have different values to them, where like, by far the sort of most superlative experience in terms of just being unusual and a little like off the wall and unexpected was getting to meet Mr. Rubik, because that, I mean, anyone who reads the book will find out that like there's sort of multiple narratives. There's kind of the narrative of me trying to solve the cube as fast as I can, and there's also kind of this historical narrative that I'm trying to piece together, and you get to see me in the process of trying to put it together, because that's sort of a story in and of itself, where like, you know, it took me about 2 years to get a face-to-face interview with Erno Rubik, which I didn't know was going to happen until the day before it happened. You know, I was like in Budapest and I'd gone all the way there, and I was like, man, I really hope this happens. And then it did. But as far as things I actually learned, there's almost no end to it. Like, I really can't pick one, because, you know, that was ultimately what made the book such a rewarding experience to write, and will hopefully make it rewarding for folks to read, is that, you know, the cube itself is kind of an example of the unexpected hiding in the everyday, right? Where like it looks so innocuous, it looks so simple, and yet it literally contains, you know, quintillions of possibilities. It's like having a universe in the palm of your hand. So, you know, it was surprising in a cultural dimension to sort of, you know, the moment soon after I started getting into that world from a, you know, because obviously I wasn't just a participant at the time, I was an observer as well. It's kind of two roles simultaneously. So as I was getting into cubing, I had this bizarre moment of like, you know, anyone who's seen M. Night Shyamalan's movie, The Sixth Sense, there's that famous line, I see dead people. It was like, I see Rubik's Cubes. Like everywhere I looked, suddenly there was a Rubik's Cube. You look on the television, the radio, etc. Like I could just be watching breaking news about something really important, like, you know, the bombings at the Boston Marathon. And I vividly remember one of the news anchors just, you know, she was really harried out in the field. Like no one knew what was happening. And she's like, well, she just said to the Wolf Blitzer or something, well, it's all a Rubik's Cube right now. And I was like, wait, what'd she just say? Like normally that would have just totally passed through in one ear and out the other. But I just started noticing how baked in the Rubik's Cube was into the culture. Like it was so omnipresent that it had completely escaped my notice to that point. It's like suddenly you see it in a TV show or a commercial, or like, you know, I remember getting like Thor on DVD, or the second Thor movie, Thor: The Dark World. And there was just this little moment that's where Natalie Portman's character, you know, the part of the whole plot of that movie was there being portals to other dimensions that were randomly opening. You know, obviously that led to nothing good. But, she sort of is testing this out and like drops her keys, and it's very conspicuous that there's like a Rubik's Cube keychain because she's an astrophysicist and very smart. And it's like, it was interesting just to see the way, because again, that's just something people don't really think about, right? That's why, because I'm sure a lot of cubers have experienced that of like you solve for somebody and they're like, oh my God, you're a genius. And you're like, no, I just put a lot of time into this. But that's sort of the cultural role of the Rubik's Cube, right? That's the role we've assigned it. It's like this is the sort of symbol of this is a symbol of intelligence, and in particular kind of intelligence, like problem solving, being smart in a kind of quantitative way. So that was really interesting. But definitely I think the most surprising, and I actually might change my answer if you asked me tomorrow or the next day or something, but it was surprising to learn how the cube worked, to sort of like look back from the vantage of like, oh, now I've broken 20 seconds, and look back at how I used to look at the cube, and, your vision just changes where you start to get to see more when you glance at it, whereas in the past it was difficult to be like, man, where's that third edge piece? I got to make the cross. At a certain point, you're like, oh, I can see these next two pairs coming up nicely, and I shall put them in now. But it was very surprising, just the sort of historical angle of like, I think Tom Kramer was probably the figure that surprised me the most in terms of, everyone knows in the cubing world about Mr. Rubik, right? And even people outside the world, they know about him even if they don't, because they've been saying his name for 40 odd years, even if they don't realize they're saying his name and not some bizarre made up adjective. That's something I still enjoy explaining to people, that Rubik's cube is a possessive, like Einstein's theory of relativity, right? Like it's the cube of Rubik. It's not Rubix cube, right? Which I still meet people who didn't know that, and they're excited to learn about that. But even to me, someone who knew that there was a specific man named Erno Rubik who created this, the story of how the cube got to all our hands was just hands down the most fascinating thing to me, because it's just one of those moments where, like, history is so contingent, right? Where, like, when you look back with the benefit of hindsight, it seems like this coherent narrative where it's like, how could it have happened any other way, right? And so looking now, where the cube is the world's most popular puzzle, it's like, it seems very likely, even that moment in WALL-E, that Pixar film where it's like, centuries from now, the planet's so polluted, we all left and we're just, being obese and drinking sodas on a spaceship and watching TV. Which I suppose is not too different from like the mean now, certainly in this country, but we're doing it in space, which is just cooler. Anyway, that little robot finds a cube centuries from now, and that's basically all that humans have left on the earth of any value besides piles of junk. And that could totally happen, right? Plastic takes a long time to degrade. There's like, what, 1 billion? There's so many Rubik's cubes out there, no one knows how many there are. It could be like 1 billion. But anyway, the fact that seems so inevitable now really belies the fact that it was so contingent on these very specific people and these very specific moments. And I think the story of Tom Kramer really encapsulates that. And I won't give away too much, I guess, but I'll just summarize by saying that. So Tom Kramer is the businessman who played probably the biggest role in getting Rubik's Cube to market. And his life story is just incredible. I mean, it's an example of one incredibly unlikely contingent moment after another. He in short, was born a Jew in Transylvania, which is, was sort of, I guess, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time, something like that. It's a long time ago. But he was interned in the same camp by the Nazis, where Anne Frank ultimately perished. And through a sort of, because he happened to be there at a very specific window, he got to get out because of an exchange where German prisoners of war were exchanged for camp prisoners. And, he had this incredible series of events in his life that wound up leading to him discovering the Rubik's Cube at a German toy fair after having married into the British aristocracy and, helping bring it to the world. I mean, if the events of his life hadn't given him this incredible degree of persistence, he might have given up. But because he had been through so much, he just sort of, he was able to endure anything. He was no skin off his back to spend 2 years circling the globe, just knocking on doors, trying to convince people the cube was worth making a mass market product out of. So that's one of those moments where it's you sort of peel back the wrapping and you're like, wow, I had no idea this was what was inside. So that was genuinely surprising to me.
Yeah, so we're going to kind of wrap things up. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast. I'll have links in the description to the new paperback that should be out as of right now when this podcast goes live. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you. I want to thank Ian Sheffler one more time. Check the description of a link of where you can buy the book. You can go to Amazon. I got a copy off iTunes for iBooks. There'll be a giveaway where 5 people are going to be able to win a book, but there's usually a ton of entries, so don't just rely on that. If you want one of the books, I would definitely just suggest going and getting it anyways. You can enter by going speedcubeview.com/podcast. That's also where you can go and submit questions. If you're listening to this on iTunes, please go and leave a review. It greatly helps the show. If you listen to this on YouTube, please hit like and subscribe. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you guys later.